Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled Stargate and DeepSeek, the International and Technological Implications of the AI Arms Race. We're so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Elizabeth Dickinson, and I am an Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. Our speakers today are John Villasenor, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Law at UCLA and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and Neil Chilson, the head of AI policy at the Abundance Institute. And last but not least, our moderator today is Ashkhen Kazaryan, senior fellow with Free Speech and Peace at Stand Together. You can find more about today's moderator and panelists at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org. That I'll hand it off to you, Ash. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're very excited to be here, and thank you to FedSoc for organizing. Let's dive right into the topic. There is a lot going on in AI news and in news in general every day. To me personally, it feels like there is a new AI development every single hour. It goes with the speed of light, and maybe with all these AI developments, we will reach the speed of light soon enough. To discuss these developments and how they interact with the politics and policy and geopolitics, we have two fascinating and incredible speakers. So I'm just going to start by establishing the baseline of what's going on. Let's talk about what Project Stargate and DeepSeek are. Neil, do you want to talk about Stargate, and then I'll ask John what DeepSeek is?
Sure. So Stargate is a project that was announced by President Trump along with some of the top CEOs and innovators in the AI space at the White House. It is nominally a $500 billion private investment that will build out data centers and the other types of infrastructure that are needed to do artificial intelligence software, the type of software that we've seen through OpenAI's ChatGPT and lots of other programs as well. And so the companies partnered in this are a Japanese investment fund, Oracle, and OpenAI, and then there's a whole bunch of other technology partners who are also working along with this, but those are the three who were at the White House and leading this. The initial project is said to, the initial tranche of money is around $100 billion to be spent, and some of the projects are already underway. And so this is a sort of announcement after sort of a rebranding in some ways of some projects that were ongoing in Texas in particular. Trump explained that this would be a project that created 100,000 jobs under his estimate. It's a big construction project, one can think of it that way. And the government's role here is primarily, as Trump put it, to get some of the red tape out of the way. In particular, the emphasis was on sort of the energy permitting challenges that maybe the federal government has a role and a possibility of streamlining the approval process for those types of new energy sources that might be co-located with some of these data centers. And so that's what Project Stargate is. It's cool, it's big, it's fun that was an early announcement from the Trump White House. But it's primarily a private development with some streamlining of regulation by government.
John, what about DeepSeek?
So DeepSeek, as many attendees no doubt are aware, is a startup company based over in China that really burst into the headlines a couple of weeks ago because they have released some AI large language models that have really remarkable performance. And it actually goes back a little earlier than that. They released initially a model back in late December of 2024, and then a newer model a few weeks after that. And what was really caught the attention of a lot of people around the world about this is that they're based in China, which means that they are operating subject to a very strict set of export controls imposed by the United States. In other words, they can't have access, or at least in theory, they don't have access to the most advanced, for example, GPUs from NVIDIA. So despite that lack of access, and they went into some detail about saying how much resources they claim to have used in training these models, and if those claims are accurate, then DeepSeek was able to create very, very effective, highly performant large language models using a much less lower amount of computation power than other comparable large language models have required. And so, the day that sort of really ricocheted across the news, the NASDAQ dropped something like 3%. And of course, the broader message there, which a lot of people really got to thinking about, was, first of all, is the United States as far ahead of China on AI as has commonly been assumed? And clearly the DeepSeek news suggests that the answer to that question is probably no. And secondly, and I think somewhat more fundamentally, DeepSeek is an illustration of the fact that the scarcity created by the US export controls actually spurs innovation, and in some ways, paradoxically, may have actually helped China advance in AI because they were pushed to operate under these very significant computational constraints. And so it's a really interesting kind of rethinking of the landscape, and I have more to say about it, but that's a 3-minute summary.
I appreciate both of those summaries. There are a lot of topics that kind of overlap with this. So let's start with just Stargate, and then we're going to mix them up together. What do you think is the potential effectiveness of Stargate in bolstering American AI capabilities, and how can we evaluate it, right? So there's been a lot of drama between tech CEOs on social media that has been just personally entertaining about even having funding to do it. But let's assume there is funding, there's at least the first 100 billion that's already being deployed. How do we measure effectiveness? How can it reinforce the infrastructure and help the American companies? Let's start with Neil and then go to John.
So, I already said, I don't think the money is the most interesting part of this announcement. The companies are already investing tons and tons of money. Sam Altman has said he wants to raise $1 trillion to build stuff. So it wasn't, the money's not really the surprise, and whether or not it's there or not, there are people who want to invest in this stuff. And I think that there will be a lot of investment going forward. What would be success for me is the government side of this. Like, how much faster can they actually build stuff given this partnership than maybe other data centers have in the past? Because the regulatory environment really, really matters for data center deployment. And we've seen this in state regulation where companies are making choices about where to build data centers based on what are the laws around, can you build, but then also what are the regulatory laws around the types of software they might run and the company's liability for unauthorized uses, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm really curious about that dimension of it. How does the policy choices here affect the building speed? I'm hopeful that they can do something at the federal level that will make this a faster process. And I think if that happens, I think it will benefit us. There's a lot in the post DeepSeek announcement. There's a lot of concern about, do we really need $100 billion worth of compute and this new energy capacity? And, I work for a place called the Abundance Institute. I would love an abundance of compute and abundance of energy. I don't think these are things that, that we're going to run out of demand for in the near future. And so I think, we should build more. We should build data centers. And the question is, how can the government help companies do that?
John, how do you measure the effectiveness of this first?
Yeah, no,
state?
I think Neil said, and I absolutely agree that with or without Stargate, these companies were set to invest really extraordinary amounts of money because they, I think, rightly understand that AI is just fundamentally important to their own future as companies. But I think what's really notable about this is I think it's helpful to contrast this with the Biden administration. The Biden administration, with respect to AI, had what I consider to be sort of a very fear-based approach. Basically, it's sort of for example, the executive order they came out with and the general tenor seem to sort of suggest a view that AI is this, really problematic technology that, yeah, maybe it has some benefits, but we really got to kind of put the brakes on it and rein it in and make sure to, erect a whole bunch of guardrails. And I think the Trump administration, to its credit, has what I at least perceive so far to be a more balanced view of AI, understanding that first and foremost, it is absolutely fundamental to the geopolitical and economic future success of the United States to have a robust AI ecosystem. We need to remain leaders in that space. And I think the new administration also understands that hamstringing the AI industry with a bunch of very burdensome regulations sort of along the lines of what you see, for example, right now in Europe is really not the way to spur growth in the industry. So regardless of the specifics of how Stargate rolls out, I think, the fact that the Trump administration, I think, revoked the Biden administration's October 2023 AI executive order early in the first weeks of the administration, and then announced the Stargate project, I think it telegraphs a real interest and appreciation of the importance of AI to the American economy and to America geopolitically.
We have these different competing paradigms and different approaches to regulation of AI, right? We just spoke about even changing it in the United States from the Biden admin to Trump admin. We're also seeing in Europe, the European governments together starting to think that they might be left behind in this AI development race and thinking of shifting their approach. And now we have this company out of China that's private, but obviously with involvement from the government and just the jurisdiction that they're under. How are these different competing paradigms interacting with each other, affecting the global development of AI? And what are the things we should be kind of thinking about where we think about these different types of development? We'll go to Neil and then John.
Oh man, there's so much there. I'm trying to pick what I might want to say. It's interesting. There is a big conference in Paris right now on AI, and a lot of the news out of that has been that this one looks different than the previous ones that were in Seoul and that were in UK, which were much more focused on risks. To Villasenor's point earlier. And so this one seems to be, at least the statement that's coming out is not as focused on those sort of existential risk questions. And there's a lot of grumbling from like the AI doomer crowd about that. But there's also these interesting announcements about the countries wanting to do these big public investments in that, which is a very European way to do innovation. But it does seem like everybody is realizing, hey, we can't afford to sit back and do nothing in this space. The US right now still, I think, is in the technical lead. The DeepSeek model, one thing that John didn't mention, but he obviously knows, is that all of the DeepSeek's innovations were open sourced, right? So like we know how they did this stuff. They wrote the white papers, they shared it, they even shared their models. And so you can download these models and use them. And I think the US companies are going to build on what they had, just like DeepSeek built on everything that the US companies had done. And so this is a space that is moving really fast. I think right now, the US model of private investment, private innovation, a strong ecosystem that allows people to test new products in the market is winning the day. And I think to the extent that Europe, continues to double down on sort of government-led AI innovation, they're going to get government-style results. And China is, a different animal around that space. But thus far, the DeepSeek release has primarily been a sort of a good thing overall for AI innovation, I think, honestly. It's also a nice kick in the pants to the US, who I think maybe we were sort of feeling like, we got this in the bag. It's a good reminder that, hey, this is a really dominant space. Software is always been a space in which innovation can sort of happen, from the side very quickly from somebody you didn't even know was there. And we should be aware of that. And I think we can expect that to continue to happen in the AI space as well.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, perhaps state the obvious here is that AI is that we've got a global ecosystem here, right? And there are brilliant engineers all over the world. And we're going to see amazing innovations coming out from lots of different countries. Not only in the United States, not only China, they're going to be, really good innovations in lots of different places. And so to Neil's point earlier on, the question is, if we're going to have innovation in lots of different places, where will that innovation then get translated into really high impact outcomes? That's largely a question of, or significantly a question of, the overall economic and regulatory climate. And that's an area where I think the United States has enormous potential. And the other thing I'll say is, we talk about AI kind of as a general thing, but we have to always keep in mind that AI is, a gazillion different things. And, what makes sense for AI in pharmaceuticals is going to be very different, and it's going to raise a different set of issues than AI in terms of autonomous vehicles and in terms of large language models and in terms of climate forecasting. I mean, there's just any number of areas in terms of defense. And so, again, I know it's helpful to talk about AI writ large, but at the end of the day, some of these different applications are going to obviously require different sorts of regulatory regimes or not to ensure safety. For example, if there's AI being used in the cockpit of a commercial jetliner, I think we would all want that to be subjected to a different level of regulation than AI that's being used to recommend recipes to make cookies, right? So a bunch of different applications.
Speaking of some type of regulations and tools governments use, let's talk about export controls. John, you mentioned them at the beginning. How do you see export controls as a tool to try for a country to put themselves first in this arms race for AI? Is the creation and current success of DeepSeek showing that maybe those tools don't work? Or what's the, there's a lot of conversation if the export controls are fully abided by. There's speculation that some of the chips for Singapore still make their way to China. Feel free to
I'd say a
this
couple of things.
Go
A couple
ahead.
things on this. So first of all, just for context, the Biden administration in the last week of the administration released something called an interim final rule. It was the Department of Commerce that released this interim final rule, which if it actually ends up sort of taking effect in 120 days after it was released, imposes I think, a pretty draconian set of restrictions on the ability of American companies to sell advanced computing chips all over the world. And it basically partitions the world into 3 tiers of countries. And I won't go into all the details, but it really will stifle opportunities for American companies to sell advanced computing chips to many places like Brazil and India and places like that, without, to my view, any real benefit to export, benefit to sort of maintaining American AI leadership. In terms of so I'm hoping that the Trump administration will revise or backpedal on that rule, but of course we'll have to see what happens. Whether export controls work, I mean, with AI, it's not like export controls in the 1960s for like plutonium. The difference is an AI, an advanced computing chip, you don't have to physically have it in your hand to use it, right? It can be 500 miles away or 1,000 miles away. So one way to end run around these export controls is people in export control jurisdictions, even though the rules may forbid it, might find ways to basically access these high performing chips in jurisdictions where they are located that aren't export controlled. As Ash mentioned, there's also a black market. I'm not sure how big it is, but it's sure that it exists to some extent. And then there's the broader question of whether the export controls actually may have this paradoxical kind of counter effect of actually spurring innovation. So, I don't think they work as well as their most, ardent proponents would argue. But I do think it's certainly true that the lack of access to the most advanced GPUs has made it harder for Chinese companies to do as much AI work as they wanted. I'll just say actually two more quick points to follow up on the export control thing. China in particular has focused on AI supremacy, or at least capability, as an absolutely core aspect of its development plan. I mean, it's very different from Europe in that respect. And so I think we're going to see just enormous amounts of effort in places like China to develop their own domestic capabilities to manufacture these chips. And the final thing I'll say is, advanced computing chips aren't only used for AI. So when we place export controls on these chips, we're also impeding the ability of American companies to supply countries like Brazil and India with data center chips that can be used for any number of applications, many of which have little or nothing to do with AI. So that's, there's a lot of complexity, and I think a lot of negative consequences to at least the proposed export control regime that the Biden administration put in place right before the inauguration.
I'll just add really quickly that John talked about the three tiers, and it's really ham-fisted the current diffusion rule that Biden administration put on it. It lumps together countries like Yemen, Poland, and Portugal under tier 2, and one of the effects that this is almost certainly going to have is that American companies who want to sell, computing chips to Portugal now aren't going to be able to make that money that they would be able to make selling to like an ally. I think Israel is also in tier 2, right?
Correct.
So there's some very interesting, why is it such a broad brush? And in that set of restrictions here around selling to some very close allies and friendly countries, and if you do that, you reduce the ability of some of our innovators here in the U.S. who built these amazing chips to take that money and turn it back into reinvestment and keep ahead in this innovation fight for the next great technology. And so, I shared John's sort of skepticism of their overall ability. The other thing is that there's an effect here on open source technology as well. And the US should want to be the leader in open source technology. And if we have export controls that make it hard for other countries to use the open source technology that we have, they will use the open source technology that's developed somewhere else, right? It's a very attractive sort of price and innovation platform. And so using U.S. Open source AI, I think, is better generally for global influence of our country than if they're using open source technology that's developed in China or the Middle East or somewhere else.
And just to tee off what Neil just said, to the extent that we sort of wall off, American technology in this respect, we really contribute to the pressures that spur development of a non-US global ecosystem for this technology, where these other countries of pure necessity, if India can't get as many chips as it wants from the United States, they're going to buy them from somewhere else. And you end up de-emphasizing the importance and role of the United States in the world as an AI leader. And that's bad for all sorts of reasons, including for the one that Neil mentioned, which is that strong sales by US companies to the global market generate revenues, which then get turned directly into more US jobs and more investment in startup companies and the very things that we need to grow our AI ecosystem.
Going back a little bit to Stargate and the red tape, can we dive in a little bit into what the red tape is? What do you see as a top priority on addressing or even getting rid of? This government seems to be very fond of getting rid of things. So what would you recommend them to look at first? We'll go Neil and then John.
Well, I think where the federal government probably has the biggest role in this type of space, like I already mentioned the role of the states, and we should dig in there because there are a lot of concerns about how states are approaching AI regulation. Texas, I already mentioned that the Project Stargate already has some ongoing investments in Texas. Texas is right now considering a sort of European style AI regulation that I think would be quite bad. And so it's like kind of ironic that Texas is considering that right when there's all this potential investment, like just sitting on the threshold of being dumped into the Texas economy. And so one thing that the states could do is think hard about like how to have pro-innovation, development and deployment of AI within their jurisdiction. So at the federal level, I think the primary role here is probably around energy production and building, right? And so we have a lot of rules around the types of energy that can be built and how it has to be approved by the federal government. I know Texas is actually leading a lawsuit along with Utah and a company that does what are called small modular reactors, right? And these are small, safe nuclear power plants that could be put next to a data center locally and provide really good energy that's very sustainable and that is very, very cheap overall. But it's very hard to build one of these because of the regulatory environment around them. And so they're challenging the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, saying that this is that the current rules actually don't apply to small modular reactors. And so I think there's lots of things the federal government could do to speed up the ability to build more energy. And I think that's where they should focus when they're thinking about how to get the data centers that we need to do AI innovation in this country.
Yeah, I read a recent article on the Stargate project, which said that each of these data center campuses is going to consume on the order of 1 gigawatt of power or more. A gigawatt, so not a megawatt. Like a megawatt is a million watts, right? A gigawatt is a billion watts. So that's an absolutely prodigious amount of power, and there's no way you can supply that much power unless you've got some pretty big iron energy questions that you've answered. And so of necessity to build these and to power these data centers, you're going to need to have some pretty complicated engagements both at the state and the federal level. And to the extent that those can be streamlined, while of course ensuring proper protection of the environment and those sorts of things, that would be really important. And I expect that that's going to be a driving factor. In the same post I read, I think it said that OpenAI was considering, I think it was around 16 states that OpenAI was considering for where they were going to locate their data centers. And I would presume that perhaps at the top of the list of factors that they're going to be considering in making those decisions is the basic practicalities and regulations that they're going to encounter as they actually build and power these campuses.
One of the huge issues in AI policy is power, as you just covered. Another one is privacy and data that needs to be fed into the systems for training, and the question of our privacy and the privacy of our data as just people living in the world, people sometimes that don't know if their data that does get ciphered into this. How would you assess those questions and the tension that exists there? Neil, let's start with you and then we'll go to John.
So it's pretty interesting because I think the dominant technology that had sort of driven and motivated privacy conversations in the US, but even worldwide, was social media. And in social media, there's a very different use case for data in the advertising context than there is for data in the AI training context. I think it's kind of overblown in the advertising space. Primarily, the companies who are advertising don't particularly care who you are, but they kind of care like what are your characteristics. And so they are thinking about you as an individual because they want to appeal to you as a customer, a potential customer. That's very different, especially in these large language models. We can talk, like I said, we're speaking in generalities. I like John's point a lot that AI is many, many different things. It's a general purpose technology. And so obviously there are privacy concerns when you were talking about putting your healthcare data into a model that can help you figure out, like whether or not the particular diet that you have might be contributing to cancer or something like that, right? But the large language models, the ChatGPT style things, they care even less about who you are as an individual. What they care about is understanding the connection between a wide range of ideas. And so I don't think that, especially for these models, they do a lot of work to like not put personalized data in there. They scrape and clean up their data sources. But I don't think the data risks, the privacy risks are enormous from the sort of chat style models. Except that I will flag, for example, if you are submitting content into a service like this, if you're sending in prompts and you're asking it things, yes, then just all the regular privacy concerns arise, and you should think about them that way. And actually, we didn't talk about this, but DeepSeek not only is a set of models that were released, there's also an app, right? And so when you're interacting with that app, you're interacting with a Chinese company, and you should think of it appropriately. And so I think there's the general regular privacy concerns that come from using an online service. We have a lot of state level regulation on that in the US. But I don't think large language models in particular raise any like big new privacy concerns that we should worry about compared to what we've been talking about internet privacy generally.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I'm very concerned about digital privacy in general, but like Neil, I don't know that the newer news on AI really changes that. I think that horse left the barn a while ago, in the sense that, over the last, basically since the advent of the smartphone era, which I guess we can trace it back on the order of 15, 18 years or something by now, and the the enormous amount of information that we provide voluntarily to services like Google, there's an enormous amount of information out there about us. And so it is true, yes, if you go to a large language model and put in, let's say, some medical information, then if there haven't been precautions to prevent it from being absorbed and known by the model, that will happen. But that's also true today. Like if you hurt your knee today, start doing Google searches about symptoms of knee injuries, right? Then Google's going to know that you've got some reason to be inquiring about knee injuries, and it might conclude that you or somebody close to you has a knee injury, right? So it's really, as Neil really said, it's the online ecosystem and the absolute complete logging of essentially everything we do, which raises the privacy concerns. But I don't see, AI as really changing it. Now, I'm old enough to remember, of course, the time before cell phones. And back when I was in college, if someone had said, hey, well, would you be willing to carry around a tracking device that tracks you every minute of every hour of every day in exchange for the ability to talk whenever you want to people? A lot of us probably would have been horrified by that idea. Would have been like, oh, that's a huge privacy violation. But of course, we do that all the time now with mobile phones. And so those changes are far more fundamental in terms of the privacy implications than I think what we're going to see, at least in the near term, with AI.
That is very
Can
helpful.
I just add one extra point, which is that again, because we're talking about AI so generally, we should probably focus on specific applications, and the privacy implications are going to be radically different. Government uses of large language models or agents, AI agents of some kind, could raise all sorts of privacy concerns as well. So I don't want to say there are no privacy concerns. I'm just saying AI as a technology, it doesn't raise them as much as AI in specific applications. And in many of those applications, we already have heightened concerns from the regulatory and technological environment that we're in.
That is a great clarification and addition. Thank you, Neil. So now we've addressed the power issue that's very important in the AI policy space. And obviously we keep repeating, but AI is very many things. So this is both a very high level and very detailed conversation. And then we now have talked about privacy more in the commercial privacy sense of it. Let's talk about job displacement. I would say I'm an AI optimist myself, personally, unbiased, as I moderate this. Sometimes I wake up and I have that anxiety that the work I am doing and the work I produce soon enough will be replaced by someone with less, experience, but just a chat GPT, and that's all much cheaper labor. How do we address these changes in job markets and anxiety that people have around the economy changing, their ability to, exist in the jobs they have? How do we kind of navigate that? And again, I know it's a very high level question, so you can take it in whatever direction you want to go. John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm optimistic in the sense that, not that I don't think there won't be some reshuffling of the employment sector, but that's not new. I mean, for example, if you look at the year 1900, I don't know the exact number, but I think it was probably something like 30% of the American workforce was employed in agriculture. And today the number is something like 2%. And technology is a big reason for that. But that doesn't mean our employment rate today is 28%, right? It's because there's a whole host of new jobs that simply didn't exist that have been created thanks to technology. So it is certainly true that there are certain kinds of jobs where AI might really make those jobs less numerous. But just as certainly it will create new jobs. And I don't think we're going to have massive unemployment due to AI in 10 or 20 years. The sector will just look different. So there's nothing. AI is new, at least at the scale we're seeing it now. But the idea of technology, I mean, again, I'm old enough to remember when you bought an airline ticket, you often had to go to a travel agent. You'd sit down physically at their desk and you'd give them all the information, and it took a long time. I don't think any of us would want to go back to that era, even though that meant that those people who were doing those jobs had to find different jobs, and I'm sure they did. So I'm optimistic that people will be gainfully employed, although there will be areas where there are specific jobs which are made less numerous due to AI.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and there probably are some policy things that we can think about, like what are the approaches to potential displacement. But right now, we don't really know how this technology is going to shake out or how fast it's going to distribute throughout. And so I think I would urge for flexibility in those types of programs. What the sort of hypotheticals and from what we know of the technology right now, the primary jobs that are going to be affected, enhanced, changed, transformed by this are ones that are, knowledge worker jobs, right? People who generate, writing, or they organize events or things like that. Like lots of things that are like, if you move a lot of information around as the primary part of your job, like these tools are going to be useful. So if you are in that space, I think you should, it's up to you, I think in part, to figure out how you can use, what would you do if you had, an extra, 50 IQ points in your pocket, right? Like, how would that change your job? Or if you could delegate to a really good research assistant certain parts of your job, like how would that change your job? And I think we can start experimenting with that now, but we don't really know the policy effects. I will flag that Anthropic, one of the big AI companies, they have a model called Claude. They just today released a analysis of de-identified prompts that had come in, and the types of careers that people, or tasks that people ask Claude to do, and where do they fall in sort of the employment spectrum. And no surprise, overwhelmingly right now, it's a lot of computer and mathematical questions, like overwhelmingly. And like the least affected jobs are things like farming, fishing, and forestry, right? Like jobs where you're actually dealing with, atoms, and you're not really, spending a lot of time moving bits around, are the ones that aren't as affected. So it's gonna be uneven effects, I think, be really interesting and exciting, and no doubt scary in many ways, and a lot of change. But I think you can try these tools for free in many ways right now, and I think everybody should, and see like how it might change their job day to day.
And the other thing I think it's helpful to keep in mind is, what are the most common jobs in America? And if you look, for example, at Indeed's list of the top 10 jobs, I mean, it includes things like construction worker, obviously not a job where you're going to see AI displacement anytime soon. It includes things like janitor, laborer, cashier, food preparation worker, server, medical assistant, bartender. I mean, so there are a ton of jobs in the United States and in the world that we're not going to see construction workers replaced by robots. I mean, construction work is super skilled and requires an enormous amount of dexterity, and those jobs are safe from AI, for any foreseeable future. So I think the laptop class tends to get a lot of angst about this, but broadly speaking, I think the American labor market is much more resilient to these sorts of changes than might initially be expected.
Can I just add to that? Not only the construction jobs are probably less affected by these LLMs, but building these data centers are giant construction projects with very sophisticated plumbing, heating and air conditioning, electrical build outs. These are big construction jobs. And when you're talking about spending an amount, I think 500 billion adjusted for inflation is kind of close to what we spent to build the interstate highway system. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of construction jobs.
We're going to have one more question and then go to audience questions. Please submit your questions in the chat, or preferably in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them. The last question I want to ask is another big, huge topic that can be 10 panels by itself, which is trade secrets, transparency, accountability, and some of this litigation that's already been going on against AI companies when it comes to a variety of things that have been used or allegedly used or accessed. And how do we even see that tension? What is the balance of, you have an open system, you have a closed system as a company. John, I know you've worked on this issue. Let's go to you and then to Neil.
Well, I mean, I'll just say briefly, I mean, as you said, we could have 10 panels on this, but trade secrets play a really valuable role in the economy. Companies have a right to develop and keep trade secrets. In fact, that's often how they maintain a competitive advantage. They don't have to, it's up to them. But there are very well-known trade, I mean, it's well known that there are some trade secrets out there like the Coca-Cola formula and the Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe and things like that. And so it is in AI as well. And obviously, there's a trade-off. I mean, some of these companies may wish to open source these models. On the other hand, some companies may also, it's not either or. Some companies may use trade secret methods to develop models, which they then release on an open source basis. And then on the litigation side, most of it's been with respect to copyright. And there's a big kind of debate going on in the policy sphere as well as now in various litigation matters about whether or not the training of these large language models using content scraped from places like the internet is a violation of is protected by fair use, or whether it's a violation of copyright. And there are good arguments people can make on both sides of that. So, but TBD, we'll see what the courts end up saying.
I'm going to go to Neil. I find it fascinating. There's a case, New York Times suing OpenAI. And basically it's flipping the theory New York Times had, because they've been sued before by authors because they've provided their articles to LexisNexis as a database. And now they're kind of on the other side of this battle 20 years later or something. Neil?
Yeah, so the tension between open and closed ecosystems in software has been around a long time. And so software is somewhat unique compared to say like the Coca-Cola formula. Like it's much easier to replicate a piece of software, and it's often very easy to take it, right? Like I fit on a thumb drive. It's security is very difficult. Also, when you have like a place like Silicon Valley where people like move between companies all the time, they take some of that knowledge with them, and it's hard to stop that. So in many ways, that's a huge boon to the development of software, but it also is a challenge when we're talking about the ability to keep that secret sauce in your company or in your country, for example, getting back to the export control debate. And so there's no easy answers to that. I think generally openness in software has been a huge benefit, even if the service that you provide, you still charge for as a closed service. And so we see a real wide range in the AI space of different business models, open, closed, open weights, but closed service. And we have companies like Meta who are spending a lot of money and then releasing these models basically for free that other people can build on. And they see it as creating a competitive advantage for them as well. And so I think right now, it's a very dynamic space. It's very open. It's very competitive. And I like to see that. I like to see people experimenting with lots of different models because we don't quite know which ones are going to be the best for any one specific situation.
We have our first question from Patricia. She's asking is AI the new frontier for weaponization, or does the whole world win? Who wants to take it first?
I'm not sure what weaponization, I mean, does she mean literally in the sense of warfare, or just being misused?
I'm guessing like an arms race, right? We've been saying, yeah, so geopolitical. So now we have this race to who's going to develop the best AI, or like, I don't think there's going to be a final boss of AI, but there is a certain point to which AI development is going to come that's going to establish the next era. I believe Mark Andreessen, for example, spoke about the most recent developments as the Sputnik moment, right? So what are the geopolitical implications here?
Well, I think the geopolitical implications are absolutely enormous in the sense that countries that are able to really be on the very leading edge of AI are going to reap the advantages in innumerable different sectors, including in terms of the technology sector. AI is going to be a fundamental part of the defense sector and how you defend, for example, against cyber attacks, which are going to be important in any future conflict. So it's really I don't think it's possible to really overstate the importance of AI in the kind of geopolitical posture that countries are going to have downstream, which is why, countries like the United States and China and countries in Europe and elsewhere understand that it's such a big priority nationally.
Yeah, I agree. It's a huge deal. There is a sort of mental model that I think some people have, including some of the entrepreneurs in this space, that once we build a big enough, smart enough AI, that's like a thing, and that will generate huge outsized benefits. They call this lots of different names, AGI or ASI. And I think you can understand that theory, but I think it's as likely that we have hundreds and hundreds, well, thousands, millions of different types of models that are used in lots of different situations for lots of different things, rather than having some like one central oracle that, if it's owned by the right country, will get outsized benefits. And so I think the benefits will be diffuse of this technology. Even if some of the benefits go to the people who have the cutting edge frontier models. But I think the proportion is probably a little bit different than some of those people think about it now. And so geopolitically, I think what that means is that this is a leveling up technology. This is kind of like the cell phones were to African telecom infrastructure, where they didn't bother building the wire lines because they just built the cell towers, right? They sort of jumped a technology. And so I think there are huge benefits to this technology when you think about the ability to have a pretty good doctor in any remote area of the world, or pretty good medical advice in any remote area of the world, who can talk about your specific symptoms and your specific condition and give advice. Those types of things, just multiply that by across lots of different spaces. And I think the benefits can be very diffuse. But it's important that countries be ready to take advantage of that.
And I'm to add to that, I think it's really important to underscore that there are plenty of applications where it's not as if the spoils go to the winner, in the sense that, for example, pharmaceuticals is one of the most promising areas of AI. AI is extremely good at something called protein folding, which is absolutely critical for certain kinds of drug development. And if somebody somewhere in some country is able to use AI-based protein folding to come up with a drug that brings a disease, really important cure for a disease that was previously incurable, everybody wins, right? And that's a benefit for humanity as a whole, which is one of the reasons why I think I would like the United States to be the leader in AI, but I don't want the other countries in the world to be impoverished in AI. I want a robust global AI ecosystem, because there'll be more innovative people thinking about innovative ways to use AI to come up with solutions to problems that people all over the world have.
I don't see other questions, so I'm going to use my moderator privileges and ask another one. As we have mentioned, there is this kind of tension between federal right now government and state governments when it comes to AI regulation. There has been laws that passed in California in the last session. Now there are other states that are passing laws. There's one, the big one, that would have affected, for example, open source, that Governor Newsom had vetoed. Can you name one or two bills and what they kind of have in their substance that would affect negatively or positively AI development in the United States? Neil, you had mentioned Texas. Do you want to give a little bit more detail so our attendees can go and look it up?
Sure, I'll talk a little about. So Texas has a bill called TRAIGA, which is TRAIGA. And that bill, regulates both the deployment, the distribution, and the development of AI models. And it really is a sort of comprehensive EU-style approach that is not so much focused on known risks, but is really worried about future risks. And it's very focused on algorithmic discrimination as its primary harm that it's trying to prevent. And so in many ways, this is a law that is unnecessary, given that discrimination is illegal under Texas law. The types of discrimination that's worried about is illegal under Texas law and federal law. And it raises a bunch of practical issues. Some of the requirements that it has would require model developers to take reasonable best efforts to ensure that people can't misuse their models. But if you know anything about these models, they're very general, And often, especially the open source ones, you have no mechanisms to control the applications to which people might put those models. And so I think model developers will face some really tough questions if there's a law like this that goes into effect about whether or not they'll distribute their models in Texas. I think that would be bad for innovation. Let me just say there's good models in Utah. Utah has a great AI bill that focuses on creating a group that studies specific sets of problems and offers legislative recommendations to the legislature about how to solve those specific problems. So they've been working through a process about the use of AI chatbots in mental health situations, and they're offering some proposed legislation to the legislature on that. I think that's a very good approach that's focused on specific uses rather than on the abstract level, and which is trying to study hard the problems and offer constructive solutions rather than trying to predict all the problems that are future and write some big comprehensive bill to solve them now.
I'll just add that I think there can be a role for thoughtful state-based legislation, but I do worry that if it becomes too cumbersome, then you end up with essentially 50 different jurisdictions, each with its own specific reporting and other restrictions on AI systems. And that just makes it really hard for a company to operate. And so I think, to the extent that there is going to be regulation in this space, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind the practical burdens on these companies if there are a bunch of different potentially conflicting regulations in a bunch of different states.
As we wrap up, Stargate gets announced, then we have DeepSeek kind of taking off, affecting the markets, affecting the American companies, caps. How do you see in general the economic side of this all? Do you think that in the long run, the markets are kind of balancing itself out? We already are seeing it kind of, the tilt is coming back. What is the effect on the economy here? And just any final thoughts you want to have? Let's do Neil and John.
I mean, AI is important because artificial intelligence is important because human intelligence is important, and we're trying to build new tools to help us get things done. AI, these new large language models and other types of machine learning are really powerful tools, and so I think the long-term and medium-term and even near-term effects of these, I think, are going to be hugely beneficial in helping people get things done. It will change a lot about certain jobs, and I think it probably will change a lot about how lots of organizations are structured as well. And so I think we can expect to see a lot of changes in the near future, but it's a growth technology. This is a positive sum technology that I think is going to deliver a lot of value. And so I'm very optimistic about its impact on the economy.
I think it's helpful. I'm also optimistic, and I also think it's helpful to kind of remind ourselves how quickly this has really changed. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I really don't think we would have been spurred to have a webinar on a topic like this. And it's just, first the release of ChatGPT, and then everything that's happened since then that has really made us all so much more aware of the extraordinary progress. And that's only a couple of years. And so if you fast forward 5 or 10 or 15 years, we can't even imagine what the benefits of this technology are going to be, but I'm quite sure they're going to be absolutely profound. And I'll also just close by saying that that's why, just through an accident of timing, the new administration is taking office at a time of absolutely fundamental importance for artificial intelligence generally and the American AI ecosystem specifically. The next 4 years and beyond, but certainly the next 4 years spans a period where we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know it's going to be profound and impactful. And that's why really good stewardship at the federal level and at the state level, and of course by the companies, is going to be really vital if we're going to really maximize the economic potential and the benefits that we can get from this technology.
I want to thank Neil and John for a very positive reinforcement that we're going in the right direction and that all of our fears will be addressed and we will all be okay. If you want to read more of their work, you can Google them, I guess, Neil Chilson and John Villasenor, and look up their work. We will also, I think, link to their pages in the on the FedSoc page for this webinar. We want to thank FedSoc for having us. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Ashkhen, for moderating and organizing this panel. Thank you. And thank you again to John and Neil for joining us and sharing your insights today. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for submitting your questions. And for more content like this from the Regulatory Transparency Project here at the Federalist Society, discussing the regulatory state and the American way of life, please visit us at regproject.org. That is regproject.org. Thank you so much.